morning, everyone. Happy Easter. The tradition testimony today is from the book of Mark, chapter 16, verses 1 through 8. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. The people's testimony is from Rainier Maria Rilke, Letters to a Young Poet, 1929. Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart, and try to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms and like books that are now written in a very foreign tongue. Do not seek the answers which cannot be given you, because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer.
Thank you, Lori. When we were dating 14 years ago, can you believe it's been 14 years, Stephanie? When we were dating 14 years ago, Stephanie and I were having this wonderful day in Portland. You see, we lived in Yamhill County, so going to Portland was a very special event for us. And we went to Rimsky's. It was my first time ever at Rimsky's. And Stephanie sat us down at a table that she knew was going to shake every once in a while, because that's fun. If you've ever been to Rimsky's, you probably know they have some trick tables. If you've not been there, I'm sorry to have ruined the surprise for you. So we were having this really awesome conversation. And I don't remember any of it now. But what I do remember is when Stephanie and I started talking about something I felt quite strongly about. And I asked her, "Well, what do you think about this?" And she said, "I don't know." And I said, "How can you not know? This is not something you get to just not know about. You have to have an opinion." And she said, "You know, for somebody who says that they serve and they worship a God beyond all knowing, you sure seem to think that you need to have everything figured out. You seem so uncomfortable with mystery. Aren't Christians supposed to be humble?" I had no answers for that. A few days later, she sent me the quote by Rilke that was read a moment ago. We are talking about the ending of the book of Mark today. And this is awesome for me because this is my favorite gospel, and we've been spending months in it. Months and months. It's also the most mysterious of the Easter stories. And I'm reminded from this conversation Steph had with me years ago, and from our text, that making space for mystery in our faith is important because it allows us to make space for God. Making space for mystery is holding our faith, our theology, our Christology, our relationships with one another in humility. You've heard me bemoan before the difficulties of trying to work with people who think they know everything that matters already. But if we can hold things with an air of incompletion, I think it allows us to hold to God in faith and in hope, even when the answers that we crave fail to present themselves. And in that vein, our Easter text today is dripping with mystery. It's just saturated in it. Now, what Lori read is the original ending to the book of Mark, but it doesn't end like we expect. Now, some of you may be thinking, hey, I've read the book of Mark, Giuseppe. I've read the ending, and there's more to it than what Lori just read. You're right. In our Bibles, we include 2 extra bonus entries. And they are written decades, even centuries afterwards. I'm going to sum up the longest one first. And as I share it, I bet it's going to sound pretty familiar to a lot of you. So, after what was just read, Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene. And Mary goes and she tells the disciples, hey, I saw Jesus. And the disciples don't believe her. And then Jesus appears to 2 disciples on their way out of Jerusalem. And the disciples are so excited. They're not the 11 disciples. They're other disciples. But they're so excited, they go back to Jerusalem and they tell the disciples. And you know what they say? Yeah, we don't believe you. And then Jesus appears to the 12 minus 1 disciples while they're eating dinner, and they're gobsmacked, and he chastises them. Hey, you didn't believe those other folks, and I told you I was going to die and come back. How dare you? But I'm here. And then we hear about Jesus ascending to heaven, and Jesus says, hey, you know, before he goes, I want you to go out into all the world and share my teachings with everybody. And I also want to give you an idea of what to expect in the days and years to come. You know, you're going to get bitten by snakes, but don't worry because you're not going to get poisoned. And people are going to give you poison to drink, but don't worry because you're not going to die. And you're going to heal people, and you're going to speak in tongues. And if all of this sounds familiar, that's because it's from the Gospels of Matthew, Luke, John, and there's a good healthy dose of the book of Acts in there too. Now, these other works have been heavily influenced by Mark. They all know that Mark exists because Mark is the earliest of the Gospels. It's the first one to get written down. And they choose, these other Gospels, what to include and what not to. And some of them include these huge chunks of Mark at different times, and other times they'll say, Mark, you're kind of intense here. We're going to take it down a notch, and they make it a little bit more palatable, especially during those times when Jesus is saying to the disciples, you're being dumb. They'll say, well, you know, Jesus was a little less forthright than that, a little nicer. But they don't leave this ending alone. They add onto it. And I don't want you to think like these are all innovations of these authors. They're writing down what is said and what is embraced in their communities. But they're all written after Mark. Now, I mentioned there's 2 extra endings. The other extra ending, so this last one I just told you about is written in the 200s. Mark itself originally was written between 60 and 70 AD, and scholars believe it was closer to 70 AD. So about 3 or 4 decades after Jesus died. But shortly before Jerusalem was leveled. An event that was felt like the beginning of the end of the world to those who were there. Just as war always feels when we're in the thick of it, right? So this longer ending, the one that's most familiar to us, this hodgepodge, blenderized Easter ending, it's written in the 200s. But there's another shorter ending that's put in there too, and it's written at the latest in the 300s. And it's this poetic but short line. We saw it on the screen a moment ago, but I'm going to sum it up real quick. I took it out? How dare I? Thank you. And all that had been commanded to them, they told briefly to those around Peter. And afterwards, Jesus himself sent out through them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. This is a nice bow. The longer ending is a nice bow as well. But let me share why people felt the need to add a bow. In the text that was read a moment ago, did you pick up on how the book of Mark, how the Easter story ends? Let me sum it up. 3 ladies, Salome, Mary Magdalene, and another Mary. They all go down to the grave of Jesus. So this is a rock-hewn area. And they see, startling enough, as they're trying to do burial preparation work on his body, that the tomb's open. And next to the open tomb, we see an individual sitting there. Now, the other texts, they'll tell us it's an angel. Mark might imply that, but he doesn't say that. He leaves room for interpretation. There is a young man clad in a white robe. That's the descriptor we're giving. And he sure seems to know some stuff going on here, but we don't know that he's an angel just yet, or ever. That possibility is not eliminated, but it's not blatant. And he tells these 3 ladies, hey, Jesus isn't here. He rose. Look, that's where his body would have been, and it's not there now. Got a special job for you. You need to go over to the disciples and tell them that Jesus is waiting for them in Galilee. Well, what do the women do? Can we put that text back up there? I want you to see I'm not making this up. Right before that. That very last line. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Is that how you remember the Easter story going? No. This is how Mark ends it. Can you see why later scribes would want to put something more satisfying on there? Put a bow on it? Because this is uncomfortable. Mark leaves it open. What happens next? Well, it's a mystery. Did the women ever get over their fear? Well, you're not going to know that from Mark. Well, I mean, you will if you listen to the other endings, but you're not going to know it from Mark originally. Did they ever say anything to anyone? Or were they silent forever? Did the disciples ever go to Galilee? Did they ever reconcile with Jesus? Keep in mind, Peter denied Jesus 3 times. They all abandoned him. We hear Jesus is waiting for them in Galilee. Sounds like he wants to reconcile, but we're not told if they ever do. The way the story ends, we just don't know. Did anyone see Jesus raised? Did he teach them anything? How was he raised? Was it spiritually? Was it as a specter? Specter, by the way, is my favorite word for ghost. Was it physically? Was it as a vision? Keep in mind, vision is how he appeared to Paul, right? When he finished his time with them, what did he do? Did he ascend to heaven? Mark leaves all of this open, and he doesn't tell us what happens next. And so we have people, these communities, they're wrestling with all of this. And I believe they wrote down what they knew to be true. Just as Mark is writing down what he knows to be true. And just because something ends open-ended doesn't mean that these other endings are wrong. I'm just pointing out that it's mysterious. And I think that's the point. I think that is a point in our faith that we often just lose track of. Life is mysterious. God is mysterious. I like that this problem in Mark exists because I think this makes room for us. It makes room for those of us with different perspectives on Jesus, on what his resurrection would have meant and looked like. And it makes room for those with more traditional views. You're here, you're in this text. But it also makes room for those of us with less traditional and more open views. And it highlights something important for us to see. Different communities in the earliest days of the church saw Jesus differently. And they still keep these works preserved together. That should be instructive to us. They coexist with one another. Mark exists next to Matthew and Luke and John. That makes me a little sad that we often have such a hard time existing alongside each other with different views of Jesus and God. Why are we so uncomfortable with mystery? If Jesus and Easter needs to be a little bit more tidy for you, well, I've got good news. You've got verses 9 through 20. It's there. But if you need Jesus and Easter to be less concrete, less formulated, well, that is also here. And I cannot tell you that either is more or less legitimate from this text. Mark ends originally where it does, and we can't get around that, and I wish we would stop trying to get around it. And it represents the most original Christian community to put Jesus' story to paper. But the extended ending of Mark also exists because of other communities of Christians. Those who really did seek and embrace an assurance of Jesus resurrected bodily, engaging with and repairing relationships with his followers. Both of those are profound stories, right? For hundreds of years, Christians of different communities held different views. And it wasn't until they felt the need to be legitimate in the eyes of the Roman government that they made a concerted effort for all Christian communities to believe the same thing. To say this is official, orthodox, legitimate Christianity, and that over there, it's unofficial, it's illegitimate. Why? It's even heretical. But in the wild days of the early church, there was a plurality. Well, what's the real Easter story then? I'm going to give us something to hold on to. I'm going to caution myself, though, and try not to make it too much of a bow. In Mark, Easter is a mystery, and Easter is us. It's God continuing the reconciling work of Jesus in us. In us, flawed, beloved people who don't go and share the messages that we should, who don't get it, who are often wrong, who deny Jesus, betray Jesus, and yet, Jesus is there, inviting us to Galilee. God works still to this day in the beautiful, mysterious mess of our lives with love beyond knowing and patience beyond bearing. And we encounter Jesus long since killed, yet risen indeed. And we even get a taste of that Ionios life, so abundant it overflows from this moment into the world to come. How we make sense of this, well, it's up to you. And I find that to be good news indeed.